Welcome, everybody. We're really pleased to have you here this evening. I'm really excited to be hosting this. My name's Holly, and I'm joined by Hayley and Becky and Julianne. And Becky, who I'm sure most of you know, is going to be hosting this evening's webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Becky.
Thank you, Holly, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to spend the next hour talking about a topic that I hope that many of you will find useful, and it would have been very, very useful for me sort of 9 years ago as I was going through my own journey. We're going to be talking about choosing a donor. But before we start, I just want to do some introductions. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Becky Kearns. I'm also known as Defining Mum through my Instagram account. I'm also the founder of Paths to Parenthood, which is a donor conception support platform. And we're really, really pleased to be partnering with Apricity to bring you this informative webinar. And I'm joined by my lovely colleagues through Paths to Parenthood, Hayley King and Julianne Boutaleb. Do you want to just take a moment to introduce yourself? I'll come to you first, Hayley.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. So yeah, I'm Hayley, and I work with Becky on Paths to Parenthood, taking over the role of operations manager, as well as managing some of the more LGBTQ plus content. I'm DCP Journey to RP on Instagram if you follow any of us over there. And I'm a donor conceived person, found out quite late in life, but I'm also a mum to donor conceived twins with my wife. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, really.
There's lots of hearts flying up the screen,
Oh, I know
Hayley. I
that's
think
what
you're
I'm
very
thinking.
popular.
Loving the hearts.
No pressure, Julianne. Over to you.
Gosh, well, they're coming up towards me, so maybe some of them are for me. I'm delighted to be here on this webinar. My name is Julianne Boutaleb. I'm the clinical director and founder of, oh my goodness, Parenthood in Mind. And I've worked very closely with both Hayley and Becky over the last, I think, 4 years in terms of bringing different topics and different sort of aspects of donor conception to life in a manner of ways, both within online webinars, within real life conferences, and also in terms of developing and creating resources to help you with what we know is often a very overwhelming decision. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening and ready to get stuck in with all of your questions and issues.
Thank you, Julianne, and we're delighted to have you. And for those of you that don't know Julianne, I'm sure by the end of this hour you'll be wanting to hear more from her. She has so many amazing insights. And what we're really going to be focusing on today is that emotional mindset and the emotional process of choosing a donor. I think there have been lots and lots of different sessions out there around practically how things work, but very rarely do clinics actually focus on that experience that you're going through when you're choosing a donor, whether you've known that you're going to need to use a donor or whether it's something you've had to come to and make your mind up very, very quickly. It is a huge decision, and often through the work that I do it's a point in the process, I think, of becoming a parent through donor conception where a lot of people can suddenly become stuck and suddenly become very overwhelmed. And it can feel like a real a life-changing decision. And I always say it's almost like a life-making decision as well, because you are making a life. And that's why the emotional mindset and really looking after ourselves is really, really important. So we're going to start with that. I think we'll start with the emotional side of things. So with you, Julianne, and what I really want to kind of focus on first is just bringing it right back to why does this decision feel so huge for us? Because I'm, I mean, I know from my own experience, my clinic that I used abroad were very blasé about this decision and were just going, don't worry, we'll just match you. And it was only when I was looking back the other day, I realized just how, looking at my own emails that I was sending, how difficult I was finding the actual acceptance of it and kind of realizing it was real. So, why does that moment feel so huge?
Without sounding terribly trite, because it is a huge moment. And, you know, I've written about donor conception for a few years now. And I think one of the things that often, you know, in the interface between the clinic and, you know, wherever it is that you're coming to this decision from, the interface often is a mismatch of sorts. As you say, often the clinic is just seeing it as yet another step in your fertility journey. And what I'm always at pains to point out is that actually it's a new path to parenthood. It's not just another IVF cycle. And whilst it can often be introduced as such or, considered as such by the clinic. I think the reality is that most couples, whether hetero couples or, same-sex couples, there is, as you say, this moment where suddenly the enormity of choosing another variable in, another decision, having to make another momentous decision in what is possibly already a long, long line of decisions that has perhaps ended in loss or in failure or in difficulties. And now here you are on potentially another path to parenthood, facing another momentous decision. I think the other thing is that there is a sort of a traumatic aspect. Again, depending on, where you've come from to this decision, it's often the case for, hetero couples that actually this is a path that has not been a first choice path. Some people describe it to me as a last chance saloon, as the final roll of the dice, as, so the feelings around moving and having to choose a donor may be very, very mixed, and there may be a huge degree of ambivalence. Again, whether you're solo or partnered, there may also be this sense of overwhelm. And sometimes, couples, whether queer or not, may not be on the same page with how quickly or not they want to choose a donor or what characteristics they want to hold in mind when thinking about a donor. But essentially, I think the other thing that's really important here is that you are potentially inviting another variable, potentially, the donor as another person potentially into what is often a very closed off space. And that's a very, very difficult thing to have in your mind. The last thing I will say is that this is a decision that you're often given a time limit and, and a sense of time pressure with as well. So you're having to make this huge decision at that moment with a time limit, but you're also asked potentially, and particularly if you want to think about, the potential child that you're creating at this moment, you're potentially also being asked to throw yourself forward to, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and what, your potential child may think or may feel about the decisions that you have made. So that really is why it is so momentous, a decision to make.
Yeah. And like you say, it just is, isn't it? And I think also what makes it really difficult is there can be a lot of unknowns still in this making this decision. It might be that you only know certain things about this person. You might be that you still don't know whether or not it's going to work. And there's just so many different things that you almost, if you had that crystal ball, it would make it so much easier, but you don't. And so you have to kind of work your way through it. And I still look back, and even just reading the emails to and from my clinic the other day, it really was a leap of faith that I had, that this was going to work and this was going to kind of make my dream come true. And thankfully it did. But for many people, I think when you're in that moment, like we said around the projecting yourself forward, and I always say this, I wish at the time I'd been able to project myself forward to sitting with my child and having that conversation, them saying, oh, well, who is she? Tell me more about her. And actually, because I have such limited information from us going abroad, I find that really difficult now because I can only tell them very, very basic characteristics. And it's one of the reasons why I love working with Apricity is I know that they really do try and give a real sense of who the person is through the letters and other information that you find out. And so thinking about that moment, the fears we might have in that moment, what do you see as some of the common fears that people have at the moment where they're trying to take that leap of faith and move forward?
I think one of the biggest fears is the fear of loss, a fear of what it will mean, losing that genetic link. Who will this child be potentially for me, for my partner, for my parents, for my sisters, my brothers? All of us who go down this path are wanting to create a family. And we do that for really profound reasons of wanting to belong, of wanting to pass on family legacy. And so I think there's often a very overwhelming sense of loss. You're sort of crossing the Rubicon in terms potentially of what you imagined this story to be. I think the word dream is also a very powerful thing. We often talk about, don't we, reconceiving the dream, that perhaps this isn't how you imagined you'd want to start a family. And again, it's about feeling the feelings of that. That might be about disappointment. It might be about, you know, anger that perhaps this is, you know, the way that you'll have to make a family and take on the complexity of that. And I think that's something we often don't speak about, you know, that there's a complexity to this journey that potentially carries on throughout, you know, the child's lifetime and the family's lifetime. I think there's also a fear around, you know, who this child will be. Will we bond with this child? And I think that often becomes very, very real, particularly at the point when you're being asked to consider physical characteristics or, you know, personality traits. And because there you have a real point of imagining your child, you know, and who they will be, who they will look like. And, you know, it's that huge moment where, again, you have to project yourself forward and imagine who your child will be and what they will look like. And this is often part of becoming a parent anyway. But I think when it comes to the donor conception pathway to parenthood, what we're you know, potentially being asked to do is to reimagine, to reconceive this dream, and to be able to hold on to the complexity of what we're doing, not just for us and for, you know, perhaps the person we're doing it with, but also for our potential child. And I think there's also feelings, you know, definitely in, you know, the same-sex community of, you know, having to invite somebody in to actually have a child, you know, that may come with really complex feelings as well of, you know, who will carry, who will be, you know, the genetically, you know, related one, who won't be, what does this mean for us and our roles? So I think there's a real complexity at this point, which can often feel very overwhelming when people come to the point of actually choosing donor.
Yeah, there is so much going on. And I think, as you said there, it's kind of that moment where the genetic loss and that loss becomes very real in that sense, that you're suddenly having to almost, in a way, replace yourself if you are the non-genetic parent with somebody else who you might not know that much about. And how do you, no one's ever really considered how they would do that. So I think some of it is kind of appreciating what that means, and I think being kind to yourself in what that means as well, because I just looking back over those emails I sent, I don't think I was. I think I felt like I was overreacting when I was asking questions, and that maybe it was just me feeling this way. But I can tell you we've had probably over 100 questions through for tonight, and the themes have been very, very similar around genetic loss, around that fear around bonding that you mentioned. And so hopefully we can kind of give you a bit of an insight today that even just says to you that you're not on your own here. There are so many other people who are feeling the way that you feel. But just going back to those complexities, I think one of the things I wanted to touch on, and I think I wrote a post at the end of last week on Instagram about some of the complexities I felt in terms of the real mix of emotions that I was feeling at exactly the same time. So obviously that feeling of loss, but also that feeling of hope at the same time. And how do you hold those together? That feeling of fear around the donor and actually being very vulnerable, feeling fear around possibly being replaced one day, yet also feeling so grateful for what this person was giving me in terms of a chance to be a mom. And yeah, just fears around what that would mean in the future for me, at the same time as feeling excitement. And I found that really, really hard. It was like a roller coaster. So one minute I'd go, yes, I'm fine with this and we're moving. The next minute the reality would hit and I'd have a wobble. And actually my husband did a lot of kind of picking me back up, and then I'd pick him back up. And so I just want to talk about that kind of roller coaster a little bit of emotions, and what would you say is quite usual to feel during this process, Julianne?
Well, exactly what you described, but also, and I really want people to be assured by this, we are talking about complexity here. There is no way that you're going to resolve this now. You You know, and I think that's the most common fantasy, that if I'm not fully resolved and, you know, I haven't worked out all of these really complex emotions, you know, if I'm not feeling more excitement than uncertainty, does this mean I shouldn't be doing this? You know, that's often a very common theme when I meet individuals and couples thinking about donor conception. And I would say, no, that's not it at all. This hopefully, you know, I think one of the key messages, you know, that I want to get out there, and particularly in the work that I do with you and Hayley, is that this is a lifetime's worth of, you know, resolving, working things out, having to go back again, because this is your story right now, and it's going to become your child's story and your family story and your extended family story as well. So there's layers and layers of this that cannot possibly be worked out and resolved before you go for transfer, or even before you get pregnant, or even when you're pregnant. In other words, there's so many layers of complexity here, that what I would really say to anybody listening is, give yourself some grace. This is a lifetime's worth of complexity. There'll be a lifetime's worth of having to resolve and come back to this over and over again. And sometimes you won't think about it at all. But I think what's really important, and I know some people look at me when I say this, is take your time. Talk to people who have done it before. And I know sometimes there is a time limit, but sometimes I feel clinics often push people into these decisions quite quickly. And I would say, please take your time. Please wait and, you know, take advice from others. Perhaps meet somebody like myself or one of my team who, you know, we're specially trained to help you think through some of these issues. Allow yourself, if you're coupled, have the differences of opinion to speak about it. Try and find your very particular village. In other words, the sorts of offerings you have on Paths to Parenthood or within the Donor Conception Network. Meet with others who are perhaps a little bit further on down the path, because it's really important to normalise that this is a complex process and it takes time. And I think the preparation is understanding that this will have an emotional feel to it. It isn't, as often presented, just a sort of a clinical tick box exercise. There will be emotions attached to probably every single decision that you have to make in deciding, you know, which donor you're going to go with. And I know Hayley and you are going to go into the complexities of what those decisions are. Give yourself time, give yourself grace. Don't expect yourself not to have a wobble. You will have a wobble. Have your village and your network, and have the people who can let you sob and wobble and be there for you. Please take it easy on yourselves.
Exactly. Thank you, Julianne. And I know that is why we created Paths to Parenthood, to be that space where you can explore, you can dip your toe into, you can listen to other people's lived experiences, you can watch a webinar around genetic loss with Julianne, or you can watch a webinar around, I'm worried about attachment and bonding. Let's watch that and just give yourself time to kind of work through. And we have a common fears resource, which is a really great way to go, right, actually, I'm feeling this. I'm going to dip my toe into this today and see how I feel. And actually, we are getting more and more people join who are at that very early stage. Even I'm at the end of the line with my own eggs and I'm still making that decision, but it allows you to explore it in a safe space. And I do think, I mean, that's exactly what I would have needed. And to know that a wobble is normal makes such a difference. It kind of just relieves that burden of thinking it's not just me and this is normal. And I do think with what you said there, and from my own experience, this is a whole process, and it's a process. It doesn't just stop when you've made the decision to go down this route. It doesn't stop when you've chosen a donor. It doesn't stop when you're going through pregnancy, parenting. There's all of these different things, but you do work through it and you become more comfortable with things as you go along. And I think that's why it's so important to have that ongoing support. And I think the final point I'll make before I come round to Hayley is, and we had a question around, how do you know when it's the right one? How do you know when it's right? And I think it has to just feel right enough for you. And everybody is different in terms of that right enough and what that means. So for some, you will want so much information just to allow you to feel that. Some people will be more comfortable with less information, but it is about feeling right enough to take that next step. And like you said, Julianne, I don't think anyone will ever go absolutely 100% yes to take this leap. You might be waiting years to get to that point. You may never get to that point, but it is about it being right enough for you to take that next step. But keep that support around you as well. So Hayley, we wanted to get a little bit more into the kind of the practical side of choosing a donor, and obviously you bring the experience of being a parent to two children with your wife through donor conception, but also as a donor conceived person as well. You've got the lived experience from that perspective, which is really, really useful. Can you just give us a bit of kind of background to your story and how it's kind of brought you to what you do today?
Yeah, thank you, Becky. So I was born very early 80s through IVF. And like I said, my parents told me this growing up, and it was one of those stories you used to tell at parties and things, that I was an IVF baby, quite an early one, obviously with the first baby, Louise Brown, being born only a couple of years before me. But then I found out in my 30s, so over 10 years ago now, that as part of that treatment, they used an anonymous sperm donor. So obviously that was a huge shock. And I think over that time, you know, we worked through it as a family, the disclosure, and I started just talking a bit more about my story, I suppose, online, and we got in contact, Becky, didn't we? And obviously we do a lot of work together now, but I suppose I share my story a little bit from the perspective, I suppose, being late discovery, but also being born from a fully anonymous donor. So my parents' sperm donor was fully anonymous because that was very standard practice back in the 80s. But I've since been able to find him through commercial DNA testing. And I think being able to connect and meet with him, because I was very curious, and I think that would be something that we probably do pick up on in this webinar. I was curious just to know who he was. And it's kind of shaped a little bit, I suppose, how I'm now dealing with my own children. So my wife and I had twins. My wife carried the pregnancy and we used her eggs, and we had Quinn and Adia in 2017. And yeah, I think it's just, I kind of share a little bit around what I've learned, I suppose, from connecting with Jonathan, who is my parents' sperm donor, and then maybe how we're talking to our children. And yeah, I think I found out a lot about the process, things I didn't know when my wife and I went through treatment, or certainly when I found out I was donor conceived, about things to maybe consider if you are right at the start of your journey, and things that I'd like to try and help people and share, I suppose, what I've learned really, certainly around sort of donor choice, and how some of the choices I think you make at this really early stage, I think Julianne touched on it as well, can go on to potentially impact your family further on down the line. And I know, Becky, you've talked about that too. So they're all just like really important topics that I hope my lived experience can help other people. Yeah.
Thank you. And we're going to move on to talk a little bit around, there were a few questions we had through around kind of anonymous donation versus open ID versus known. And I think just before we do, just to share, if I've spoken about this quite a lot, but my own experience is that obviously we have 3 children through egg donation. We went to the Czech Republic. This was sort of 9 years ago now. And we used a fully anonymous donor. And as I said, at the time, there was no support like this around. And my one regret from the whole kind of experience is the fact that the girls won't have that kind of automatic option to be able to find out who that person is. And so I've been a strong advocate for open ID, or if you have the option to use a known donor. I just think from that parental perspective, once you have them in front of you, you kind of see it through a slightly different lens, and you think, actually, I can completely understand, and having heard your story, Hayley, why that curiosity might be there, and actually to understand that without feeling threatened by that curiosity as well. Because I know from your story, many others, it isn't to replace an existing parent, it's to know more about where you come from. And so let's just touch on what are the different options. Obviously, there's fully anonymous, what is open ID, which is what you can get through clinics such as Fertility, and then also what do we need to consider around known donation as well?
Yeah, I mean, they're broadly the 3, I suppose, categories. Like I say, historically, it was always anonymous donation. I think one of the first countries was Sweden to introduce what we now know as open ID, where the child can request identifying information of the donor when they turn a certain age. In different countries, that age is different. Some it's 16, some it's 18, and some it's down to the individual child if a psychologist deems them capable of receiving that information. In the UK, it's open ID at 18. So regardless of where the donor's from in the world, if they're imported in or used, they've been located from the UK, they will be open ID at 18. But as we know, anonymous donation still exists, obviously, in lots of parts of the world. And a lot of it does sometimes come down to accessibility of treatment. Certainly, like you say, Becky, you went abroad because it was more accessible for yourself, wasn't it? For yourself and Matt. But then you are limited with your donor choice in terms of anonymity. I mean, with known donation, I mean, that could be a whole other webinar. In fact, I've actually just recorded a webinar today with an amazing legal professional around things to consider with known donation. But I mean, broadly, known donation can come from a friend or family member or an acquaintance, or more common, actually becoming more common now is someone being sourced through kind of internet matching groups and things. But they're kind of like the broad choices. If you are having treatment in the UK, the law defines that they have to be open ID, and that changed in 2005. But like I say, we do see, obviously, people are free to move to different countries to have treatment. And a lot of the time, even if you're a UK resident, obviously, if you're having treatment abroad, your child will have the rights that are defined by that country that you're having treatment in. So that's why I always sort of say that, it's always really helpful to ask lots of questions around the laws in that country of treatment, about the donors, the information that you can or can't get. Because ultimately, I suppose, moving forward, thinking ahead, your child might be really curious at different ages about who the donor is. They might not be at all. I think sometimes we just don't know. But I always try to say, if you've got the option to keep that door open for the identifying information, then I would say try and keep it open for your child. They might not want to walk through that door, but it's open for them. If the door's shut, then automatically, a bit like me, really, being born from an anonymous donor, I had to then go through DNA testing, and it wasn't the best experience, if I'm honest. I'm fortunate in that I was able to find info, but you can't always do that. So yeah, it's lots to consider when it comes to different types of anonymity.
There are, but I think for me, just hearing that conversation here, like, okay, there are different options, and what does this mean? It can be really, really helpful. And I know we'll be talking with Fertility shortly about kind of how that works in terms of how they work matching with individual donors. But you mentioned there different questions to ask, Hayley, and this is something I think we get asked all the time. I'm going through this. What questions do I ask my clinic or bank, and how do I kind of start to know whether or not it's the right one for me? And I know you've recently produced a resource for people to use to support them in asking the questions, because we always advocate for ask the questions, arm yourself with information to be able to make these decisions.
Yeah, that's right. And there are loads of questions. I think when I originally came up with sort of the resource, there were like 20 odd questions, but I managed to sort of split them down into the top 5 that I would sort of recommend asking. And it is a free resource, and I'll get the our lovely guys over at Fertility. I think they're going to attach the link to a follow-up email. I'm not sure if I'm able to put it in the chat this evening. If I can, I will. But broadly, I think, again, touching on what you mentioned around sometimes you can be a bit hesitant to ask questions, a bit nervous, and a bit like, oh, am I entitled to this information? And I would say, actually, no, this is really a momentous decision you're making, and you're entitled to ask questions around the donor. And don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't always rely on what's just on their websites. I would say, ask some more questions. If there is a gap about something, if they don't talk around like worldwide family limits, for example, so ask, for example, whether the donors that are used, where do they come from? For example, do they originate from the country that the clinic or the sperm bank is at? We find now that many, certainly sperm banks, will recruit donors from all over the world, and they're imported and exported. So ask the question, because it will make potentially a difference to how many children and families are created from the one donor. So that's just one question to ask, for example. And a lot of sperm banks and clinics don't always have that information readily available. And another big one I think I would say is just around the donors themselves. I think, again, going back to years gone by, anonymity was kind of obviously promised and relatively secure, and then obviously commercial DNA testing came along, and even we're offering open ID donors till 18, but with the advent of commercial DNA testing, we can't really even promise that anymore. So I would sort of ask the questions along the lines of, do you, one, offer your donors counselling? So when they maybe are able to find a donor, or a donor approaches a clinic or a bank, do they have a counselling session, the donor? Do they actually get to speak to a professional like Julianne, who has great amount of experience and is able to talk through the long-term implications of being a donor? How is that going to potentially impact you and your family if you go on to have one, your own children, all of these things? And it's not to put anybody off, it's just to make sure that the donors are kind of going into it the same as parents, really, with their eyes open, things that might come up in the future. So yeah, do counsel your donors. What level of counselling do they get? And family limits, and what are they? Oh, two big ones, but there's loads more. And like I say, I've written them all down in a helpful resource. So
yeah, that is really helpful. I think arm yourself with information and don't be afraid to ask questions. Again, looking back at those emails I sent, I was just so apologetic for asking the simplest question when it is something that is really huge for you. And obviously, we're going to be talking a little bit more with Apricity about how that works soon for them. But I have heard there are clinics in the UK that don't counsel their donors, and it is something that they need to consider, the fact that somebody may get in contact in the future. So for me, I think very, very important that the donors are being treated in the right way when it comes to this as well, because it is a huge process for them as well. Julianne, just coming back to you now, I want to just talk specifically a little bit more around some of the smaller decisions that we take when it comes to choosing a donor, and things that, again, can feel quite huge at the time. So specifics such as, how do we decide on what characteristics are important to us in a donor physically, but also from that kind of perspective of maybe academic achievements, what they're interested in from a hobby perspective, different ethnicities and kind of cultural backgrounds. There's all of these different things. And like we said earlier, you don't often imagine yourself having to make this choice of someone who, in many cases, might be kind of standing in place of your own genetics. So how do you do that when you know that, and I always say this, you're never going to find that clone of you, you're never going to find you. So it's working out in terms of those kind of smaller decisions within the big decision. What is important to you? What would you say to people?
I think often what I see at that stage is that people, overwhelmed by the uncertainty, can often get very stuck on very particular characteristics. And it's almost like a decision paralysis, and it is almost like a trauma response. It's, what if I make the wrong decision? What if and I think sometimes, and we've done a session recently with Apricity, haven't we? And we spoke through some of those things that from, the professional's point of view, there can be a sort of a sense of confusion or of amusement. But why are you turning down this donor? We know she's a known donor, and she has, really good quality eggs, and it could often be a mystification as to, oh, why aren't you taking this chance? And again, it might seem like minutiae to the clinic or, to somebody who's not having to make these decisions. But essentially, again, what they're trying to do is to reimagine this child. Will this child look familiar? Will this child look like, other children in my extended family? Will they look like me? And again, we know genetically, you can be fully genetically linked to your child and they can look nothing like you. So, but again, these are the sorts of things that I think are often the echoes of the loss, of the potential of genetic loss, and also the loss of control that donor conception may signal for some people. And of course, wanting to have an idea or some sort of sense of control of what the future might bring. So apart from that, I think there are some very, very important things. I think culturally, we've talked, haven't we, recently around the real lack of culturally appropriate donors in particular communities. And that might be very, very painful to, to have to let go of potentially a link with a community, whether that's, a Jewish Sephardic community or, a Black African link, because essentially we're talking about family legacy. And what is it that we're letting go of if we don't have a culturally or racially, appropriate match? So that might be a very, very, loaded, profound sense of grief and, distress. But then it can also be on the other end of things where it's around, trying to match the child with our aspirations, with our expectations, with our longings for who we would like them to be. And that's often where, academic considerations might come in. I think one of the other things that people often overlook, and I often sort of remind some of the people I see, is why is the donor doing this? Is that known? Is that something that they've been able to leave information about? And I know for many of the donor conceived adults I work with, that can be very important. A sense of why did the donor do this? Is there a sense from the information you're getting from your clinic as to what the reasons are behind the person doing this?
Yeah.
What is it that they want to provide? Because that's very important in terms of your potential child welcoming in the donor in their conception story. I think the other thing that can, be very painful again is the sense of fearfulness around what if I take this donor and perhaps another donor that's more suitable comes along? Can I afford to wait? And of course, waiting being such a painful experience for many people going through this. Should I say no to this donor because I don't feel they're matched enough with what I've asked for, in the hope that another donor might come along? And again, I think what that's often about psychologically is letting go of this idea that you're going to get a perfect match.
Yeah.
You're not. And it's about trying to decide what the most important things are for you. And also in terms of the story of conception. And that's something that, Jerry, who works with us very closely, talks about. What is the story about this person? And what I think is really fascinating with some of the couples I see who decide to go abroad, understanding the motivations of the donor can be very important, and also the links with particular cities or particular countries because of earlier links in their family tree or family link. And I often say to people, pause, take your time, find out more about, what the sort of links may be. If perhaps there was a grandmother with blue eyes and actually your eyes are green, we're all an amazing amalgam and result of years and years, centuries, if you like, of family legacy that has been passed on. And it's really important to keep an open mind about that. Where we can get stuck is in the physical characteristics. And I would say family legacy is much more than physical characteristics. Of course, you want some sort of match and some sort of parity. But actually, this is about the story that you're going to pass on and give to your child as well. And I think that bit often goes missing a little bit in the sort of the more clinical range of decisions that people have to make.
Absolutely. And I think it's a legacy isn't just genetics, is it? It is so much more. It's your traditions, things you do as a family that you can incorporate as well. But I think what you said there, I think was really important, that it's trying to work out, I think, in a way, what are your non-negotiables? What are the things that you absolutely want this donor to have? But also, where are the kind of areas where you might move and you might consider something different? And I do think that what I would have found really comforting, and actually even more so as a parent now, was to know more about the personality and, like you say, why that person has donated. And that's obviously, we'll talk about apricity and the letters that the donors write to you or to the future child as well, because that allows you to paint more of a picture than a green eyes, brown hair, etc. And I think potentially could give you that comfort, but also a different way of connecting with a donor through. And I've heard so many people say, I read this letter and wow, I just felt like we had a similar sort of sense of humor. We had a similar sort of personality, and it can be even be in the intangible things like that, rather than just the physical characteristics. And like you say, nobody knows what a child is going to look like in terms of their genetics. It really is a lottery, and so I do think we get easily put into the camp of, right, they have to have exactly the same characteristics as me. but that doesn't always equal that they're going to look exactly like you, because actually they're going to be themselves. They're their own person. So
But it's
there is
also
that
being
element of letting go.
compassionate about that, Becky, that, if you are
Absolutely.
stuck at that, it's understanding, of course you are, because of course the idea, and you used the word replace earlier, but of course that is the ultimate fear, isn't it? I'm going to be
Yeah.
replaced. And it's not that. It's so if you can, I often have this image of somebody clutching on to that old dream as to what, this child will look like and who they will look like. And sometimes it is about understanding that,
Mhm.
yeah, the letters will be
Yeah.
important, the personality of the donor, the motivations of the donor, being able to weave the donor into the story that you pass on to your child might be of much more importance than, their academic history.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, we did an amazing training session with the Apricity team, who are dealing with these matches all the time, and really we were able to really get across, I think, what is going through the minds of those recipients who are having to make these decisions, but also kind of the challenges that are faced when you're tasked with that role of actually trying to make that match as well, which can be huge. And Holly, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but just before we do, I just wanted to touch on the role of, we kind of alluded to it there, but nature, but also nurture as well in this. And Julianne, I'd love to hear from you, and then Hayley, just from your own experience of nature and nurture, because I think we can get really hooked on the one thing that we kind of have an element of control over. But actually, when it comes to this, there is so much more at play. There's so many different variables. And what would you say to someone considering nature and nurture when they're coming to this?
Well, I would say we live at a time now where we have so much more information. We have the epigenetic, sort of the studies of epigenetics. We know that, the uterine environment also impacts the embryo's development. We know that, parenting is actually a relationship with a child across the child's lifetime.
Mhm.
We know that the environment for the child is also crucially important. And yes, of course, genetics, does remain an important part of anybody's history, which is why, as Hayley has said, we've had this movement in the last 20 years towards more open ID, towards more openness around who donors are and why they do what they do. And, that may be something that, a potential child will want to know more about. Know a lot in terms of, particular genetic relationships to issues like, illness or, health history and so on. And again, that is something that is collected and collated, by clinics. But beyond that, we also know that this is a relationship with a child within your family structure, and who they become and who, you become with them is an ongoing exploratory, process that happens across your lifetime. So I would always be leaning towards nurture as one of the key factors in all of this that we really should hold on to. And I guess the other thing I want to say, Becky, is that the reason I do this work, the richness of it is that anybody who's on here tonight, or anybody who attends the webinars, or anybody who comes to the conferences we run, you're already doing something amazing for your potential child. You're already nurturing them, if you like, in even sitting, thinking about, what are we going to do? Are we going to go for anonymous? Are we going to go to Spain? Are we going to stay in the UK? That's already a gift of nurture. When you think of the, tried and tested and traditional and quite frankly boring way that, the great unwashed mass of people have babies, they're most certainly not sitting thinking about these enormous, issues. And look what we've already talked about: legacy, culture, love, nurture, nature. And so already anybody who comes to these issues is already passing on a wonderful nurturing legacy to their potential child.
Absolutely. We always say you're doing so much already just by being here and opening
Yeah.
yourself up to these conversations and learning, because I know it isn't
Yeah.
easy. And And Hayley, just from your own lived experience, I mean, we've talked about how you, as a non-genetic parent, actually felt more comfortable going into that, knowing the relationship you had with your dad, who you don't share genetics with. So I just wanted to get your thoughts around the nurture nature aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about that, that kind of almost like I wish I could bottle the security I had, like reflecting back on the relationship I've got with my dad, because he is the most amazing guy. I feel incredibly lucky that the world somehow collided that meant that he could raise me. Even, you know, we don't share genetics, but he's very much my dad. And knowing that going into a parenthood as the non-genetic parent and the non-carrying parent, because my wife carried the pregnancy, I know many people in that situation would feel really insecure and really worried about bonding. And yes, I still had some worries, but I had this overwhelming sense, well, I know I'm going to love that child and that child's going to love me because of the relationship I got with my dad. And I always say that, you know, Jonathan, who was my parents' donor, gave me his genes, but my dad showed me how to wear them, you know, that kind of thing. I'm going to get a t-shirt made up with it, you know. And it's so true. And just to put some perspective without going into the drama of my day, and my internet connection absolutely went down today. And one of the first people I rang was my dad and said, can I come to your house and use your internet? So I'm sat now in my dad's spare room. And, you know, what I'm saying is, like, this relationship is lifelong, built from birth. And yeah, I mean, I do have a relationship with Jonathan, but it's not a fatherly relationship or somebody that I consider is, you know, a dad or replacement or anything like that. It was purely, he's a nice guy, we get on well. And I was curious about him. And things like we've touched on, like medical information, I think for me, as you know, I'm in my 40s now, and things are starting to go wrong, I suppose. So you look, you know, things like medical information do become important. And I think actually having been able to text Jonathan and say, you know, is this X, Y, and Z in your family line, has been very helpful. So with the nature nurture thing, what I would say is nature is important in the genetic side for things like medical history. And for some donor conceived people, it's important to know who that person is and be able to potentially maybe have some level of contact in the future. But you know, nurture, from my own lived experience, that's created who I am, I suppose, and everything about it. So that's kind of, and I've taken that forward, I think, with my own children, and hopefully I can mirror what my dad is, the relationship my dad and I have got with my own children. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thank you, Hayley. And the reason I wanted to just talk about that topic is because I think when we talk about choosing a donor, we get very, very focused on the nature. And just in having that conversation now, we've been able to lift ourselves out from that decision and think about the perspective of it being a lifelong process, it being a lifelong relationship. And yeah, hopefully it helps you to be able to almost project yourself forward a little bit. And I know that can feel scary at times, but just you making this decision now, but there is so much more to come afterwards. And I just want to invite Holly back to the screen if you're there, Holly. And obviously we've talked all about the different emotional aspects of choosing a donor, and what I really want to kind of hear from you is kind of how does that work practically? Because I'm sure lots of people are sat there having questions about, okay, so how does Apricity work in terms of matching people with donors, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's slightly different to an egg bank service in that what we offer is a personalized matching. So we have people who are continuously recruiting and onboarding donors, you know, on an ongoing basis, and then we are also matching them to people who are looking for certain characteristics. So, for, you know, usually it would involve matching you to a donor and going through a synchronized cycle to have a fresh embryo transfer, although we do also have patients who freeze embryos at this point to transfer later. That can sometimes get more complicated because many clinics require a 3-month quarantine before you go ahead, which can make it take a bit longer. So there's lots of options to consider there about whether or not you'd go for, you know, fresh or a frozen transfer, and that's discussed with a doctor. But practically speaking, the donor matching that we offer it involves matching you to a donor on 4 key kind of the minimum criteria, which is eye color, hair color, ethnic background, and height. So there's sort of like the 4 minimum characteristics that we would match on. And then part of, you know, us getting to really know our donors and our recipients as well is we can also match on preferences. So that's things like build, hair type, hobbies, interests, or educational achievements. So, you know, we can't make promises on that, and obviously the broader the criteria, the easier it is to find a match, and whereas the stricter the criteria, it can take longer. So it really depends on what's important to you. And obviously, as we've heard this evening, that it's really complex. But yeah, I mean, in terms of understanding why the donor has donated, you know, Julianne, you did bring this up, and that's really interesting because we do exactly that. You know, we provide a personal profile, so lots and lots of information about the donor. It does include a letter that she's written in her own hand, sort of about, you know, what she's like, what she's interested in, what her life is like, and in her motivations for donating. So that's quite a big thing. You know, everyone that we speak to, you know, they are altruistically motivated. They're always based in the UK. And part of that, we also provide up to 2 childhood photos of a donor as well. So that up to the age of 5, usually a baby photo and a toddler photo, just to kind of help give a bit more of a sense of what she's like. And the counselling as well. So that's another element in terms of supporting the donors. I know you brought that up earlier. So we do implications counselling at the start. Then we also offer them unlimited counselling throughout and access to our care team and the app. So yeah, looking after our donors is really, really important. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's worth acknowledging that this is a very human process, isn't it? You're supporting donors, you're supporting recipients at the same time, and kind of trying to bring the two together to make that match. And I've spoken to a number of donors through interviews that have been through Apricity, and I'm always blown away by just the kindness and the generosity and the way that they are just wanting to make that difference for somebody, and the way that how they feel as well when they hear that there's been a pregnancy and things have worked out, which is always really amazing to hear. And I just, before we move on to questions, if anyone does have any questions, do pop them in the Q&A. We're trying to get to a couple before the end, but just in terms of, often it can be challenging to kind of really meet every single criteria that someone has. What do you see as being some of the where patients struggle in making these choices? Because I know when we came in and spoke to the team, it can be really tricky at times, especially as we know when this emotional process is happening at the same time.
I think it's definitely around coming to terms with the genetic loss element. So kind of, is this child going to look like me? Will, you know, how will they be like me? So, you know, we can't give any assurances. You know, we absolutely try our best. You know, we do it on the picture matching. So on, you know, a real characteristics basis, you know, we try our best to match, you know, who we think the donor would look like and who the recipient would look like. But really, it's when we have lean heavily on experts and counsellors and those kind of resources around, exactly as you were talking about, nature versus nurture, because it's definitely the area that I think is hardest for someone to overcome. Like, are they going to be like me? You know, how will I know? Yeah.
And nobody knows, do they? It's that kind of dealing with the unknown. But it's amazing that we're having this conversation today, and it's been recognised that this is way more than just tick that box and we move on. It's a huge decision for people, and hopefully if you're watching tonight or you're watching this back, that you found it useful just to kind of validate some of those things that you might be thinking or feeling. I just want to come to the questions and just see whether there's anything we can cover here. Julianne, can I come to you with this one? So someone has asked, it's such a kind and generous gift for someone to donate their eggs. I struggle to feel deserving of such a generous gift. How do I move beyond this feeling? And it is, you're accepting something in from somebody else. And yeah, that is a real complexity, isn't it, to manage?
It is, but I would say, you know, I think that's the beauty of altruistic donors, you know, that this is obviously often somebody who wants to do this for different reasons. And as you said, Holly, the reasons are often, you know, explained in the letters potentially that they write. And often it is a sense of wanting to give back. It is a sense of wanting to give somebody the chance of becoming a parent. I think the other thing that's going through my mind is, there's also something about becoming a parent in this way where people often say to me, I don't feel worthy. I've gone through all of these hurdles, all of these things, and I finally have my baby. How am I going to live up to everything I've gone through to have this baby? And I think within the donor conception sense of things, maybe it is linked to the great gift the donor has given you, or, all the years that you've had to depend on friends and family to look, to sort of carry you forward or whatever. But the thing I would say to you is probably none of us are worthy as parents. And I've actually written a poem around this, that, you don't have to prove yourself worthy. I think there often is this sense that, because we're given the gift either through IVF or, donor IVF, that we should be grateful. And yes, there will be moments of unbelievable gratitude to your donor at different times. There will be moments, even as you watch your child grow and learn who the donor is, that they may express gratitude for the donor. And that's one of the lovely things that we often see, don't we, when we do the panels. Donor can see people saying, oh, only for my donor, I wouldn't be here. I've got great gratitude for her. And when I read her letter, I was, really, really grateful. But I think at the end of the day, what we have to balance gratitude and whether or not we're deserving with is that actually parenting is bloody hard. And there will be days where you will not feel worthy of being a parent, no matter how you've come to the parenthood. And, there is something about that I also want to get across. You don't have to be worthy. You don't have to be deserving. This is you exploring whether or not this is a path to parenthood that you and your partner or you and your own can think a way forward into. And don't put such a heavy burden on yourself, because I can tell you 9 times out of 10, you will wobble when, please God, you become a parent as well. We can't be perfect. We can't be deserving. We can't be worthy. All we can be is the best, imperfect, good enough parents that any of us strive to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly, I mean, as a member of Paths to Parenthood, you'll have that support with you through pregnancy, through parenting. And it's a very common feeling, I think, after infertility to feel that, oh, I can't complain. I can't
Yeah.
say that any of this is hard because this is
Yeah.
what I always wanted. And there's so much complexity with that as well. And I think exactly what you said there, Julianne, it is, you are deserving. It's often we don't feel like I think, I know for me at times I thought, well, maybe I'm just not meant to be a mum. Maybe this is just the way it's meant to be. And yeah, no, I am a mum. I'm a good mum. And I tell myself that, but I have those moments and we all do. Um, someone's asked you to share the poem, Julianne. I don't know whether you can share it on your Instagram on
I
Parenthood in
will.
Mind.
Maybe I'll send it to
Oh,
Holly,
yeah,
perhaps to
lovely.
send through to
Yeah,
everybody who's been on here. Yeah.
fabulous. And just one more question before we go. Hayley, I'm going to come to you with this one. What are the countries where egg donation is not anonymous? So
Yeah.
there are, yeah.
Well, yeah. So I mentioned the free resource that we've got, which I know will be sent out. That's more around the questions to ask, but we have a more extensive resource for members. So if there's anyone here on Paths to Parenthood, if you're part of the membership, I've very recently done a very, like I say, a more comprehensive resource, questions and more to do with considerations to help you make informed decisions around donor choice. And one of those topics is the types of donors and levels of anonymity and which countries you can do that. So I won't wow, do you want I've actually been able to bring it up on my screen. I can't share it, but do you want me to quickly read out, Becky, just where egg donation is?
If you if you've got that, I think just to hand.
So the countries where OpenID is allowed for egg donation is New Zealand, UK, Sweden, Switzerland, Austria, France, and Portugal. Germany allows OpenID for sperm donation, but if there's anyone here from Germany watching, you may or may not know that you can't, they don't actually have egg donation. It's not legal in Germany. So that's just something to consider. And then countries that allow OpenID and anonymous are Belgium, Denmark, Canada, USA, Greece, and Japan. So they're like the key ones where our members tend to go for treatment. But just a little point, if I know we're really short on time, but it's a really important point. When we say OpenID or OpenID at 18 or 16, it's really, really important, again, going back to asking the clinic or the bank, what does that actually mean? Because in certain countries, your child will have a legal entitlement to that donor identification information when they turn a certain age. It's written into law. So in the UK, it's governed by our regulatory body, the HFEA. A child, when turning 18, will apply for that information. Some of these countries will have open ID donors where you can have treatment, but that identifying information isn't enshrined in law, if that makes sense. So, for example, if that egg bank went bust or that clinic went bust, that information may not be held anywhere by an independent body. So really, really important. Although I've read out all those countries, and again, there's so much to talk about this subject. That's why we've done this resource, and there's so much more on the membership and Path to Parenthood if you are interested in kind of going into detail about these sort of the devil is in the detail, really, with this topic. So yeah,
Absolutely is. And I think one of the things I would always say is as well, I think there's an assumption and there's a narrative that actually accessibility of donors in the UK is really, really difficult and really long waiting lists. And that's not always the case. I think look around, have conversations. I know with the Fertility team, we'll be happy to talk. And it doesn't always mean that you're going to have to wait a really, really long time. And I think, as you say, Hayley, there is the independent body regulator in the UK, which I think can give you that level of comfort as well around these decisions. I'm very conscious that we've just run over time, and I just want to say a huge thank you to Julianne again and Hayley. I think there has been another question that's come through for Julianne, but whether we can field that to her afterwards, hopefully we can. Lots of love hearts coming up the screen, and thank you so much, Holly and Apricity, for allowing us to host this conversation, and hopefully it will be really helpful for those who are having to make these decisions in the future. So yeah, just thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Becky. We will share this as well. So it has been recorded and we'll send it round this week. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you, Julianne.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you, Hayley.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.
Have a good evening, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.